Okay, we are here in the sleep line, and we have just talked about the importance of schedule changes, how to navigate your baby as they grow older and are ready to drop naps. We talked about common setbacks and hurdles, and how the main idea of life is just to navigate things when you're in a not normal situation, and so you can roll with the punches when you're traveling or when your baby's sick or anything else that arises, but to get right back on your sleep line. Something else that can really throw your sleep line off is another inevitable situation that happens twice a year, nothing we can do about it. Daylight savings time, okay? Spring forward and fall backwards. And what we're going to do is talking about a solid game plan that you can use to enlist and tackle daylight savings time so it doesn't become this sleep-deprived merry-go-round when your child normally does sleep better. So what I want to talk about with you first is when we change the clocks an hour later in the spring, when we spring forward. And there's a lot of questions people ask. When do we do this? How do we do this? It sounds like a really complicated equation. It's really not. I'm going to simplify it for you, because if it's all about proper planning, if you can start a week ahead before you change the clocks to be later, life is going to be significantly easier, because you're not suddenly jumping from your child going from 7 p.m. bedtime to 8 p.m. bedtime. You're not suddenly keeping them up an hour later where they're having a really hard time with it, and you're waking them up in the mornings when you have to be ready for school or you have to go off to work and they're overtired from being up earlier. You know, sensitive kids have a really hard time with the clock change. If your child's adaptable, you can just go for it. Just the Sunday morning after the time change, just get into the new time, no big deal. Like as adults, we normally are okay and pretty, transitional with the time change, but kids are a lot more sensitive, and if you don't have an adaptable baby, a child that has a hard time with new situations, has a hard time adjusting to different time zones, has a hard time when little changes arise, then this is going to be for you, because it's going to help you a lot. So those are the parents I'm talking to. The parents who have babies or toddlers or kids who are not adaptable and have a hard time with transition. So what you're going to do when we change the clocks to spring forward 1 hour later, that means when your child's going to bed at 7 p.m., suddenly he's going to be expected to go to bed at 8 p.m. When he's waking up in the morning at 7 a.m., suddenly that's going to be 8 a.m. for his body, So what you want to do is some proper planning. The Sunday before the time change, a little bit less than a week before the time change, you want to start getting his body acclimated to a new time so the shift won't be as drastic. What I want you to do starting that Sunday is every 3-4 nights, bump his bedtime to be a little bit earlier by about 10-15 minute increments every 3-4 nights. So you'll spend Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, if he normally goes to bed at 7 p.m., you'll spend Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday bumping his bedtime to be 6:45-ish, 6:50. After you spend Sunday, Monday, Tuesday doing that, you'll bump to Wednesday, Thursday, bumping it a little earlier to be 6:35. 6:30. So by the time the time change rolls around, you've got a half an hour covered. So he's used to going to bed at 7, but by that first week that you've spent of every 3-4 nights at 10-15 minute increments getting his body adapted, his body will be going to bed now at 6:30. So it won't be such a drastic difference when you wake him up in the morning, because his body will be acclimated. After the time change, you spend that second week after the time change getting his body used to the second half an hour interval. And again, every 3-4 nights bumping bedtime to be 10-15 minutes earlier on his body's clock, not the new time. So 6:30 to 6:20 to 6:15 till eventually it's close to 6, which means it's his body's 6 o'clock, but really the new 7 o'clock time. And the advantage of this is that he won't be overtired in the morning. His body will adjust. So it's a 2-week process. The first week is working on the first half an hour. The second week is working on the second half an hour. And it's the same idea when you change the clocks backwards. Now this is usually more of a problem for parents, because when you change the clocks later and you make 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, people don't really mind as much, because okay, my baby sleeps normally at 7, great, now I get to sleep until 8, even though you're not really sleeping in, but it's a trick, a mind trick. Usually though, when we change the clocks backwards and 7 a.m. becomes 6 a.m. and you're waking up an hour earlier, it gets a lot harder, and this is where things can go haywire. So it's the same idea. The Sunday before the clock change, start doing some prep work on that first half an hour, except you do the opposite. Every 3-4 nights, make bedtime 10-15 minutes later. So 7 o'clock becomes 7:10, 7:15. So that way, a week into it, your baby is going to sleep around 7:30 p.m. You change the clocks an hour later, and you spend that second week working on the second half hour. His body, it's going to be 8:30, but his body's going to be 7:30. So you're going to go 7:30 to 7:40 to slowly to 8. So that way, 2 weeks into it, your baby is on the new time with his body having adjusted to going to bed an hour later. And that's how you're going to avoid overtiredness. That's how you're going to make sure that your baby's body adjusts well and that it's a smooth transition for bedtime and morning. So keep in mind, for either clock change, you spend a 2-week process. First week on the first half an hour before the clock change, and the second week after the clock change on the second half an hour, give or take, depending if you're making the clocks earlier or later. But it's really important that when you're doing this, that you don't stress, okay? You want to do whatever you can to keep calm, because sometimes it can take more than those 2 weeks for your baby's body to adapt. Even if you've spent the 2 weeks adjusting, it might take another week or 2 for their bodies to catch up, because if you have a really non-adaptable baby, it's a big shift you're making an hour. So don't magically expect it to take 2 weeks and you'll be done. You'll spend 2 weeks doing the work on your end, but it might take another few days, up to a week or even a week and a half or 2, not much more than that, to get your baby's or your toddler or your child's internal clock shifted. So don't be nervous if you see that your child is not magically adapting. Stay consistent with the methods that I've just told you about, the 2-week process, and you'll get there, okay? And you should expect imperfection, because guess what? It's not going to be perfect. You're not going to magically do these 2 weeks and your baby's going to beautifully be on schedule, especially if you have a non-adaptable baby. The more adaptable your child is, obviously the easier this transition will be, but just understand it's okay. And it takes some time. It can take about 4 or 5 weeks for a child's internal clock to shift. So if you're doing those 2 weeks of work I just told you about, the week before the time change, the week after the time change, and then another 2 weeks allowing him to adjust and adapt, then you'll be relaxed and you'll understand that perfection is a goal that we'll never obtain in parenting, but in terms of his sleeping goals, it'll take a good 4 or 5 weeks to get his internal clock set up. But having a proper game plan and a solid game plan to get all of the daylight savings time ironed out, you'll know what to do because you'll be prepared for it. So it won't suddenly nip you in the butt and you'll say, oh my gosh, I'm waking up in the 4s. When my baby used to wake up in the 5s at least, I'm exhausted. Or I have to wake my child up in the morning and it's crazy because he's so overtired. You'll have a set game plan, you'll know what to do, and you'll know what to expect. And that's the beauty of this sleep line, so you get right back into it with your child's sleep. Nothing comes as a shocker, and you're able to navigate things beautifully.